They used to whisper his name on cold Brooklyn nights, not with fear, not with admiration, but with a kind of quiet disbelief, as if they still couldn't understand how a man so deeply woven into the fabric of the underworld could one day step out of it entirely. Sammy Gravano, a name that once carried the weight of entire neighborhoods, a name that moved through dimly lit backrooms, smoky bars, and long dining tables where loyalty meant everything. Tonight, we walk gently through his story, not to judge it, not to glorify it, but simply to understand it. Let your breathing soften, let your shoulders loosen, let your thoughts drift like slow-moving clouds. This is not a story of noise. It is a story of decisions, of silence, of footsteps that led a man from shadows into history, and then out of it again. This is the sleepy story of the underboss who broke the code. Brooklyn in the 1940s wasn't the polished, bustling place it would later become. It was a patchwork of old brick buildings, cracked sidewalks, and neighborhoods stitched together by immigrant hands. The air carried the smell of coal in winter, fresh laundry in spring, and the faint, ever-present aroma of Sunday sauce drifting from windows where families spoke Italian with the music of memory. In a neighborhood like that, a boy grew up not only hearing two languages, but two sets of rules. There was the world of teachers and shopkeepers, where children were told to behave, study hard, dream big. And then there was the world of the streets, where reputation mattered more than homework, where staring too long could start a fight, and looking away too quickly could lose you respect. This is the world where Salvatore Gravano, soon known simply as Sammy, began his quiet journey. Narrator moment, soft reflection. They say some children are born watching the world instead of rushing into it. Sammy was one of them. He didn't speak much, didn't cause trouble, didn't demand attention, but he absorbed everything, from the way older boys talked, to the way shopkeepers negotiated, to the way adults whispered names with a certain reverence. Names belonging to men who walked differently, like they carried invisible crowns. Sammy noticed, and though he didn't know it yet, the world was shaping him. Gently, quietly, inevitably. Some boys fight for the thrill, others for the trouble. Sammy fought because he believed in fairness. Cinematic visual. Imagine a small schoolyard, faded lines painted on the concrete, a half-broken swing creaking in the wind, groups of boys clustered around, teasing, laughing, pushing. Sammy stood among them, shorter than most, but with a stare that never wavered. When he was picked on, he didn't run, he didn't yell, he simply reacted, calm with surprising precision, as if he had already calculated every move. People later exaggerated these stories, but the truth was simpler. Sammy didn't enjoy fighting. He just refused to be pushed aside. It's strange how little moments, tiny sparks in childhood, can grow into defining traits. That quiet resolve, to stand firm, to hold ground, to meet the world without flinching. It would one day carry him into meetings where silence was power, and eye contact was its own language. For now, he was just a boy who refused to bend. As Brooklyn pulsed with life, Sammy grew into a teenager who stood out without trying. Not because he was loud, not because he was reckless, but because he had presence. He paid attention. He moved with purpose. He treated people with a certain simple respect, the kind that earns respect in return. Older neighborhood men noticed, not the ones who wore suits and ties, but the ones who wore shadows. Men connected to the life. Men whose handshakes carried consequences. Men whose names traveled quietly, but firmly. They took interest in the young Gravano boy, not because he was dangerous, but because he was consistent. In this world, consistency is a rare gift. Some people walk toward destiny loudly. Others stumble into it by accident. But Sammy, he drifted toward it the way a boat drifts with the tide. Not forced, not rushed, just carried. The streets had chosen him long before he realized he had chosen them. Joining the underworld doesn't happen with a grand ceremony. More often, It begins with a favor, a task, a small responsibility, something that tests not strength, but reliability. Picture a quiet Brooklyn club, dim lights, a jukebox humming softly in the background, men talking in low voices, as if every word might be overheard by the walls themselves. A respected man, someone whose name carried weight, calls Sammy over, not with a shout, but with a nod that meant, "You're ready." Sammy accepts a simple task, and he completes it with the same calm precision he carried since childhood. That was all it took. No fireworks, no dramaticos, just a single step into a much larger world. This is how destinies begin, not with noise, but with quiet decisions that echo long after they're made. Sammy Gravano had taken his first step, and the path ahead would be long, shadowed, and unforgettable. As Sammy stepped deeper into the life, he discovered something quietly surprising. It wasn't the danger that pulled him in, it was the structure, the order behind the chaos, the unwritten rules that felt strangely familiar. Respect, loyalty, discipline, presence. These were values he had carried since childhood, values that now found a place where they mattered. In those years, Brooklyn was still a patchwork of small businesses, dim clubs, and narrow streets where everyone seemed to know everyone's parent, cousin, or childhood nickname. Sammy moved among them like a thread weaving through fabric. He wasn't loud, he wasn't flashy, but he was dependable. And in the underworld, dependability is a currency stronger than fear. By his late teens, Sammy Gravano had become someone, not powerful yet, but noticeable, a figure people nodded to, presence they acknowledged. That's how it begins, not with sudden fame, not with a dramatic rise, but with small moments, a handshake, a whispered compliment, a nod of approval from someone whose opinion quietly shapes the neighborhood. Sammy collected these moments like pebbles, one after another, until they formed a foundation beneath his feet. If you spend enough time around men of influence, you eventually become part of their orbit, and in time, you form your own. Sammy found himself surrounded by men who followed him not out of fear, but out of trust. He led with calmness, firmness, a steady approach that made even tense situations manageable. He didn't bark orders. He didn't intimidate. He simply expected things to be done. And they were. The small crew he gathered reflected his personality. Quietly determined, reliable, focused. They weren't the biggest. They weren't the loudest. But they were stable. And stability is rare in a world built on shifting alliances. Sometimes people rise not because they want power, but because others naturally look to them. Sammy had that quality, the kind that made people feel safer under his direction. It wasn't dominance. It was leadership. Soft, steady, unspoken. Every neighborhood in Brooklyn belonged to a larger world. A world where families weren't related by blood, but by code. Respect the structure. Respect the hierarchy. Respect the men who shaped the streets long before you were born. Sammy's reputation grew quietly, like a shadow stretching across the pavement at sundown. The higher-ups noticed. Meetings in backrooms became more frequent. Conversations lasted longer. Tasks carried more importance. He still wasn't at the top, not even close, but he had stepped into a much bigger room, one filled with powerful figures whose names were often spoken in cautionary tones. If life is a staircase, Sammy was climbing slowly, deliberately, one silent step at a time. He didn't sprint. He didn't stumble. He advanced the same way he lived, calmly. In the underworld, most men want to talk. Few want to listen. Sammy listened. He learned how older men negotiated deals, how they navigated rivalries, how they calmed tempers before they burned into feuds. He noticed the patterns of the life, how trust was earned, how alliances shifted, how timing mattered more than force. He absorbed it all like a sponge, quietly collecting knowledge that would one day guide him through storms. There is a strange power in patience, the power to act only when the moment is right, to speak only when it matters. Sammy understood that power better than most, and so his influence grew not through noise, but through observation. As the years passed, the landscape of organized crime shifted. Families grew, alliances changed, leaders rose and fell like tides shaped by unseen winds. And through those shifting tides, Sammy Gravano found himself drawn closer to one of the most powerful organizations in New York, the Gambino family. It didn't happen in a single moment. There was no dramatic invitation. No formal announcement. It happened quietly, through relationships, through trust, through the natural gravity that pulls capable men toward larger roles. Sammy had proven himself. People respected him. People relied on him. And the Gambinos, they valued men like that. It's amazing how life can guide you somewhere gently, slowly, almost without you realizing. Sammy didn't chase the Gambinos. He drifted toward them, as if carried by the current of everything he had done so far. Every world has its rules. The underworld has codes. And Sammy was a man who followed them. His loyalty was not loud, not dramatic, not performative. It was steady. He didn't betray. He didn't gossip. He didn't align himself with shifting factions. He stayed true to the men above him, the men beside him, and the men who relied on him. This is what made older bosses take notice. Not bravado, not force, but consistency. Sometimes the greatest strength a person can offer is not power, but reliability. Sammy Gravano was becoming indispensable, and he did it the only way he knew how, quietly. As the 1980s unfolded, the streets of New York seemed unchanged on the surface, but power was quietly shifting beneath them. Sammy could feel it long before anyone spoke it aloud. The old bosses were fading. Some were in prison. Some were losing their grip. Some simply couldn't keep up with the world that was changing around them. But the Gambino family, they were getting stronger, and much of that strength flowed from the alliance between Sammy Gravano and John Gotti. Despite their differences, despite one being loud and the other quiet, they worked together with a strange, unusual balance. John would make the moves. Sammy would make the plans. The rest of the family would fall into place. This wasn't friendship. It wasn't brotherhood. It was something more deliberate, a kind of partnership made from necessity and ambition. But even then, Sammy sometimes found himself wondering, how long can two strong men stand side by side, without one growing taller than the other? As the years moved forward, John Gotti became a public figure, shaking hands, smiling for cameras, turning headlines into his personal spotlight. And quietly, in the background, Sammy handled the rest. Meetings, finance, decisions no one saw, problems no one heard about. He didn't seek attention. He didn't want fame. He wanted efficiency. He wanted stability. He wanted things to work. And for a time, they did. The Gambino family became one of the most influential organizations in the country. But power, especially public power, brings something dangerous with it. Tension, agents listening, investigators watching, people talking. And Sammy knew, long before anyone said it, that the spotlight shining on Gotti meant a storm was forming, one that might eventually swallow them all. Sammy always believed in loyalty, not blind loyalty, not foolish loyalty, but the kind that came from duty and commitment. Yet as Gotti's fame grew, so did his opinions, his reactions, and his expectations. He wanted more control, more say, more obedience, and sometimes he wanted it even when he was wrong. Sammy remained patient, still, focused, but behind closed doors, he saw cracks appearing in the family. Subtle disagreements, small resentments, quiet whispers. A man like Gotti could command a room, but he couldn't silence doubt forever. And Sammy, who observed everything, knew one truth. A family can survive anything, except the moment it stops trusting its own leaders. There came a night, soft, cold, silent, when the tension finally changed shape. A meeting, a long table, voices low and steady, and Gotti speaking with certainty, as if every thought he had was the unquestionable path forward. Sammy disagreed, quietly, respectfully, but John didn't like it. A small moment, barely noticeable, yet everyone in the room felt the shift, like a door that quietly clicked shut behind them. From that night on, their partnership continued, but it was no longer the same balance. Sammy served the family. John served himself, and silently, patiently, Sammy carried the weight of both. The day the news broke, the day Gotti was taken in, the city seemed to inhale all at once. People whispered, reporters speculated, and for the first time in years, the man known for beating every charge was trapped in something he couldn't laugh away. Sammy watched quietly, not with joy, not with fear, but with a deep knowing that this storm had been building for years. And now, every decision they had made, every risk, every triumph, was being replayed in rooms filled with prosecutors and evidence. The walls were closing in, and Sammy understood something few people ever realized. When a leader falls, everyone standing beside him falls too. In the courtroom, beneath the fluorescent lights and quiet echoes, Sammy listened, tape after tape, recording after recording, and then he heard something he could never forget. His name, spoken by the man he'd supported for years, but not in loyalty, in blame. Gotti wasn't protecting him. He wasn't standing strong. He was shifting responsibility onto the very man who had held the family together. Sammy sat still, unmoving, silent, but inside, a truth settled like cold stone. Loyalty means nothing when the person above you forgets it. He didn't react in anger. He didn't react in fear. He simply understood that the world he had spent his life navigating was no longer a place where the code he believed in still existed. The rules had changed, and Sammy, for the first time in his life, had to decide what his own future would look like. A future where loyalty didn't protect him. A future where silence wasn't honored. A future where the code had already been broken, but not by him. The room was quiet. A table, 2 chairs, a federal agent waiting, and Sammy Gravano calm, collected, steady. He wasn't the kind of man who rushed into anything. He wasn't impulsive. He wasn't emotional, but he was a man of logic, of reasoning, of practicality. And in that moment, logic told him something simple. If the code is broken, then I am not the one breaking it. In the years that followed, people would talk, people would judge, people would debate. But Sammy made his decision for one reason: survival. Not the survival of reputation, not the survival of a criminal life, but the survival of himself, his clarity, his future, and the truth of what really happened behind closed doors. And when he spoke, calm, steady, and precise, he changed the course of Mafia history forever. After the storm, after the headlines, after the courtroom battles, Sammy stepped into a life that was quieter than anything he'd ever known. No meetings, no shadows, no whispered conversations in back rooms, just silence and time. Time to reflect on the places he'd been. Time to understand how the world had changed. Time to see himself not as an underworld figure, but as a man who'd lived through choices, loyalty, pressure, and the weight of a life most people could never imagine. And in that quiet, he found something unexpected. Not peace, not redemption, but clarity. Clarity about the choices he made, the loyalty he honored, and the moment he realized that silence can be a prison just as heavy as any cell. Even today, Sammy Gravano remains one of the most debated figures in Mafia history. Was he loyal? Was he ruthless? Was he right? Was he wrong? The truth is simple. He was human, a man shaped by the world he entered. A world where loyalty was currency, silence was survival, and power was always shifting. A world that no longer exists. And whether people admire him or condemn him, one thing remains undeniable. Sammy Gravano changed the Mafia. more than almost any man in the modern era. Tonight, as you close your eyes and let the noise of the world fade away, remember this story not as a tale of crime, but as a story of choices, of loyalty, of pressure, and of the quiet search for clarity. In a world built on shadows, Sammy Gravano's life is many things: complex, controversial, unforgettable, but like all stories in the end, it settles into silence. A silence where reflection lives. A silence where understanding begins. A silence where the past finally rests. Sleep well, let the story fade softly, and let the quiet take over.